want to begin with a mea culpa because I failed to get the bio of my co-author in on time, and so he was not able to read that, not his fault. But I wrote this with Campbell weekly. She is a pastor in the Oregon Conference. Her boss is just to my right. And she is also a licensed counselor who specializes in trauma care. And she also happens to be my sister, so I think she's pretty cool. And so she helped with the methodological, psychological framework of this paper. And so I do refer you to the full paper online to see the footnotes about that. If you ask about that, I will try my best, but no guarantees as far as that side of it's concerned. But this is Found Families, Confessional Communities in the Early Christian Movement. Much has been written about the origins and reasons for the early Christian adoption of fictive kinship language. In this paper, we hope to add to an understanding of the efficacy of the practice of fictive kinship by taking an interdisciplinary approach that considers recent advances in trauma care. The New Testament is univocal in its portrayal of the persecution faced by the early Christian communities. Jesus predicts this persecution, Acts narrates persecutions, Paul writes about persecutions being suffered, and Revelation speaks of persecutions still to come. Early Christians experienced trauma from displacement, arrest, loss of loved ones, or the experience of social stigma. The support provided by house churches and other Christian gatherings would have allowed for the processing of trauma and emotional healing. We do not argue that fictive kinship was an intentional method of trauma recovery. This would be anachronistic. Yet the bonds of kinship alluded to in Paul's epistles and narrated in Acts would help to explain how the young movement was able to grow in the face of trauma. We first explain the modern confessional community framework, focusing on how community has been found to be a productive method of processing trauma. We then demonstrate how many of the elements of a successful confessional community can be found in the first century Christian communities as described in the New Testament. So trauma and confessional communities. A consistent contributor for post-traumatic growth, both in individuals and groups, is positive community engagement. This concept has readily been demonstrated in the wake of a global pandemic, with early research showing social participation as an avenue for healing. When examining specific cultural groups which have endured traumatic incidents, the need for community engagement for post-traumatic growth becomes even more crucial. Therapeutic models for individual recovery, which neglect communal participation in sensitive groups, often result in prolonging or even impeding the process of healing. While many different modalities can foster post-traumatic growth, the role of social participation within a community is vital for recovery for individuals and groups within a traumatized society. Community engagement creates social support, teaches cognitive reappraisal, strengthens mutual caring, and embodies a greater abundance of positive regard and love, all significant avenues for healing. The confessional community therapeutic modality, developed by psychiatrist Kurt Thompson, merges three formidable elements for post-traumatic recovery and growth. Number one, confessional communities are rooted in interpersonal neurobiology framework, IPNB. Number two, they are structured around evidence-based practices such as group psychotherapy and narrative exposure therapy. And number three, they are led by biblical principles of spiritual formation. Meta-analysis shows that thousands of psychotherapeutic group participants have experienced significant decreases in symptoms of depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder compared to symptomatic control groups. A setting of non-judgmental relational engagement for vulnerable storytelling can be conducive for the reforming of the brain and healing of the mind, a theory supported in narrative exposure therapy outcomes. Narrative exposure therapy allows individuals to articulate their traumatic experiences within the framework of both their personal life narrative and a broader collective story. What makes Thompson's confessional communities truly unique is the integration of biblical principles. Participants are committed to creating things of goodness and beauty together as image bearers of God. Imagination is a key element of post-traumatic growth in a confessional community. Participants must be willing to practice envisioning new possibilities and engaging in new perspectives to overcome fear and shame. Without this imagination, true lasting change does not occur. Through such commitments from participants, the incorporation and interweaving of IPNB framework, evidence-based practices, and biblical principles, many have experienced recovery and post-traumatic growth through engagement with the confessional community modality. Okay. Now moving to my side of things, the New Testament. Trauma in the early Christian movement. For the sake of time, I'm just going to take as a given that trauma occurred in the lives of Christians. I have more on that on the paper. We suggest that trauma among early Christians fell into two broad categories: actual physical violence and social stigma. And so moving to the strategies among early Christians. With the ubiquity of trauma among first century Christians, methods of resilience were essential to prevent the untimely demise of the movement. For the remainder of this paper, I'm going to discuss 4 related practices attested in the New Testament that would have assisted Christians in thriving despite their difficulties. To combat the disappointment of familial disenfranchisement, the Christian communities adopted a form of Christian kinship. This led to sharing of goods and financial support of fellow Christians. Community members were instructed to encourage one another, and leaders of the movement assisted in recontextualizing the trauma being faced. All 4 strategies underlie the positive results demonstrated by the confessional community model of trauma recovery. And so the first one, kinship language and group cohesion. In their textbook on cultural anthropology, Carroll and Melvin Embers say that from an anthropological perspective, kinship provides, quote, the main structure of social action in non-commercial settings, end quote. They go on to say that for many cultures around the world, quote, mutual aid often extends to economic cooperation on a regular basis, end quote. In other words, a culture structured around a mentality of kinship assumes that family will be the primary modus operandi to ensure human flourishing. Fictive kinship served to mend the social loss experienced by Christians who were disinherited. This reimagining of family in terms of the Christian religious movement is demonstrated by the ubiquity of family language in the New Testament. To take Galatians as an example, Paul describes his audience as being children of God, children of Abraham, Paul's children, children of Sarah, and siblings to each other, just in Galatians. Paul uses the term sibling, adelphos, more than 130 times, the vast majority of which are used in the context of fictive kinship. The term is also adopted in Acts, Hebrews, James, the Petrine epistles, the Johanine epistles, and Revelation. The sheer volume of uses suggests that the language of family was widespread among early Christians. This practice would help believers to cope with the loss of kinship, the loss of biological family. Number 2, the sharing of goods. Following its narration of the giving of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost, Acts gives a summary of life within the early Christian movement. The summary in Acts 2:42 discusses how the Christians were taught by the apostles, participated in fellowship, broke bread together, ensured the needs of all the community were met, and worshiped God. A similar summary appears in Acts 4:32-37, with more of an emphasis on the sharing of goods. To understand the connection between kinship and goods sharing, it is first important to understand the fellowship held by the early believers. The Greek term koinonia, often translated as fellowship, has attracted much debate. From both a historical and literary perspective, koinonia in Acts 2:42 has strong economic connotations. Elsewhere in the New Testament, the word is used to refer to a monetary gift. It could also refer to a business partnership in 2 Corinthians 6:14, or in one of its few uses in the Septuagint, a monetary pledge in Leviticus 5:21. Evidence from inscriptions and non-literary papyri tend to use koinonia in contexts involving business or property, and it appears often in reference to marriage. Numerous papyri speak of the partnership of marriage, koinonia gamu, or gamu koinonia, as does a 2nd century BCE inscription from Perini. The use of koinonia in a marital context is instructive, as a marriage involved both a relational and economic agreement. The husband and wife would form a new household, which would involve cooperation and mutual support. This is illustrative of life in the early Christian communities, as, according to Acts, members took care of each other both socially and economically. How would such economic interdependence have been perceived in the 1st century? We suggest that the sharing of goods, as narrated in Acts, best accords with ancient views of kinship. Within the kinship structure, goods were shared and everyone was fed. In modern, peer-based therapeutic group work, this model demonstrated by the Christian community is known as mutual aid. Dominic Steinberg describes the model as a process wherein participants, 1, develop collaborative, supportive, and trustworthy relationships, 2, identify and use existing strengths and/or develop new ones, and 3, work together toward individual and/or collective psychosocial goals. Within the mutual aid model, participants share power, resources, experience, knowledge, and wisdom. This form of strengths-based treatment is considered a necessary component of mental health and recovery. The ability for individuals to mutually engage in the giving and receiving of support consistently results in improved self-efficacy and resiliency, as well as the mitigation of trauma-related symptoms. The mutual aid experienced in the fictive kinship of the early Christian communities demonstrated a foundational principle of post-traumatic growth. Believers would receive care as they were expected to care for others, leading to the holistic recovery of individual believers as well as the community at large. Number 3, encouragement. This category is fairly self-evident, but the love and encouragement that is narrated and commanded in the New Testament would have brought a level of emotional support conducive to trauma recovery. A fuller discussion is present in our paper, but we know how ubiquitous the themes of love and service are in the early Christian writings, and so for the sake of time, I'll just let you read that if you'd like. And so the 4th one I want to spend more time on, the recontextualization of trauma. We've actually heard a couple of papers already, the plenary speech, there you go. You talked about this and a few others as well, how important this is. So perhaps the most effective strategy of resilience attested in the New Testament is the redefinition and recontextualization of trauma. In this process, those who experience trauma learn to view their difficulties through the lens of growth and hope. The Gospels show Jesus as both predicting his death and teaching that his death was necessary. Later reflection, especially from Paul, would speak of the cross as the bringer of salvation and instrument of Christ's glorification. Similarly, Christian persecution was predicted in Scripture. Acts 4, after Peter and John faced threats from the religious elites, the believers quote from Psalm 2 in understanding their situation in the context of scriptural fulfillment. God's people had always been oppressed, and so the oppression they experienced only served to prove that they were on the right side. In the New Testament epistles, we see how Christians not only considered persecution a fulfillment of prophecy, it was a necessary step in spiritual development. 1 Peter 3:14 speaks about the character growth brought about by suffering, and Paul writes about the glorification in store for those who are persecuted now in Romans 8:17 and 18. Elsewhere, Paul writes that believers should rejoice in their difficulties because they ultimately led to hope. The rest of the world may view suffering as something to be avoided, but Christians were encouraged to boast in their troubles just as they boasted in God. Is this a minute left? Oh, wait. Okay, so I'm going to skip down a little bit and go down to my conclusion. Many early Christians lost social capital because of their decision to join the Christian community. Many would have faced trauma, either through state-sanctioned persecution or familial and social ostracism. Using Thompson's confessional community framework, we have suggested that many strategies used to overcome trauma today were also used among early Christians. This included the creation of new kinship groups, which would have functioned as a replacement for the family that many Christians had lost. Families ensured that fellow kinship members did not starve, and through their fictive kinship, first century Christians embraced this ethos by the sharing of goods. Emotional needs were also met through the mutual love and encouragement that is regularly taught throughout the New Testament. Christians helped each other to redefine and process trauma as an opportunity for growth and fellowship with Jesus. These strategies help to explain how a countercultural movement with little social capital could survive and thrive in the midst of oppression. Thank you.